During a legislative inquiry, the bureau leader, having held office for over 200 days, was questioned about his oversight of a notorious private contact registry and his delay in disclosing the associates connected to the severe exploitation of vulnerable individuals. The discussion clarified that while a version of this directory was obtained by journalists a half-decade prior, the current focus remained on the specific ledger currently under the bureau chief's immediate jurisdiction. In defense, it was noted that the present leadership had declassified a more substantial volume of documents than preceding administrations, who had possessed identical opportunities to unveil these files but refrained from doing so. Merely 4 minutes into what was anticipated to be a standard legislative transparency session, Representative Jamie Raskin intentionally placed a substantial crimson folder upon his desk, making direct eye contact with the investigative director and the attorney general before delivering a concise, 7-word phrase asserting his understanding of why the records remained hidden, which instantly altered the atmosphere of the chamber. The environment grew intensely quiet, not from elevated voices, but because the assertion conveyed a profound critique that bypassed standard administrative protocols and directly questioned the underlying intentions of the officials. The gathering had been arranged as an ordinary review of departmental openness and record-keeping compliance, typically characterized by the recitation of legal statutes and the exchange of pre-written remarks. Nothing in the preliminary agenda or the distributed paperwork indicated an impending clash or a highly publicized confrontation waiting to unfold. The bureau leader had arrived alongside his legal advisors, presenting meticulously organized materials that conveyed a sense of systematic preparedness and administrative command. The top legal official sat adjacent to him, maintaining a composed demeanor and a disciplined expression, having previously managed numerous inquiries where challenging questions regarding investigative files were addressed with carefully constructed statutory responses. Both officials had readied themselves to reiterate standard justifications concerning classification criteria, personal privacy safeguards, and broader safety considerations, utilizing the customary vocabulary designed to keep confidential information out of the public domain. While they anticipated some pushback, they did not foresee a complete departure from protocol, especially not one introduced as a direct allegation rather than a simple inquiry. The representative did not commence his questioning with dramatic flair or evident anger. Instead, he initiated the dialogue with specific data, understanding that precise figures possess the unique ability to disrupt institutional complacency. He opened his crimson folder and posed an unembellished question regarding the exact quantity of investigation-related files that still retained their classified status. The bureau chief exhibited a brief but noticeable hesitation, the type of pause that communicates meaning without the need for further explanation, prompting the representative to supply the data himself. Holding aloft an internal records management assessment dated earlier that year, the representative declared that nearly 3,000 specific documents linked to the closed inquiry remained shielded from public view. This substantial figure instantly recontextualized the dialogue, elevating it from a minor disagreement over a few restricted pages to a systemic inquiry regarding thousands of determinations made in secrecy. This was no longer a routine conversation about gradual openness. It had escalated into a profound dispute regarding the sheer volume and rationale of the withholdings. By highlighting the sheer magnitude of the suppressed files, the lawmaker was not merely reciting statistics. He was proposing that such an expansive scale inherently demanded a thorough justification. While a small collection of concealed pages might be excused as prudent caution, thousands of hidden files suggested a deliberate and prolonged institutional strategy. The legislative room, which had begun the day in an ordinary manner, was now deeply focused on the cited figure, reacting much like an audience absorbing a pivotal piece of testimony that alters all subsequent understanding. The director answered carefully, characterizing the sealing of documents as a fluid procedure dictated by legal guidelines and continuous threat evaluations, yet the numerical weight had already been firmly established in the public record. The lawmaker then directed his attention to the Attorney General, inquiring about the specific statutory foundation that permitted the ongoing suppression of these records years after the principal legal proceedings had concluded. The legal official responded with the customary phrasing, well known to observers of departmental proceedings, noting that such decisions encompass active inquiries, sensitive informational sources, privacy considerations, and overarching national safety concerns. It was a methodical reply, meticulously layered, legally sound, and intended to prevent oversimplification, but the representative pushed past the standard recitation to examine what the classification genuinely entailed in this specific scenario. He brought forth a legal counsel memorandum discussing the criteria for applying national security protections to criminal investigative materials concerning deceased individuals. Emphasizing portions of the memo, he noted that standard criminal files rarely meet the threshold for such elevated secrecy unless they directly involve sensitive intelligence operations or methodologies. The underlying suggestion was clear. If the matter was fundamentally a criminal probe rather than an intelligence operation, utilizing broad security claims as a universal justification warranted intense scrutiny. The officials did not interject, and their expressions remained neutral, but a distinct boundary between ordinary investigative confidentiality and broader security secrecy had been publicly established. Continuing his systematic approach, the representative introduced an additional assessment from a classification review board that had purportedly evaluated the extensive cache of documents. According to his reading of the review, an overwhelming majority, specifically 92% of the files, contained no details that would pose a demonstrable threat to national stability if disclosed. Such a vast percentage represents not a minor oversight but a dominant trend, leading to the unavoidable oversight question. If nearly 3,000 files present no profound risk, what rationale supports their ongoing concealment? The mood within the room transitioned once more, shifting from underlying tension to overt skepticism, as statistics of that magnitude naturally defy vague administrative explanations. The director answered prudently, stating that such internal evaluations are merely components of a larger, ongoing decision-making process that must adapt to evolving operational realities. He neither confirmed the specific percentage nor completely rejected it, a subtle distinction that allowed the claim that the vast majority of the sealed files lacked the risks typically justifying long-term suppression to remain active in the record. By this point, the inquiry had advanced well past customary discussions of administrative openness, evolving into a debate over whether the justifications for hiding thousands of files had been stretched far beyond their legal intent. The lawmaker employed a methodical, evidence-based strategy rather than a theatrical one, constructing his argument sequentially and compelling the officials to navigate the parameters he had established. Although he refrained from making direct accusations of misconduct, his statistical presentation strongly suggested that factors apart from genuine security concerns were influencing the situation. The Crimson folder transformed from a mere prop into the foundational evidence of a profound credibility test aimed at the nation's premier enforcement leaders. Shifting his focus, the representative addressed the broader audience, emphasizing that granular, fact-driven legislative oversight is crucial because it illuminates the true functioning of institutions under public scrutiny. He posited that the inquiry was focused not on generating a spectacle, but on examining internal procedures, as those procedures ultimately reflect institutional priorities. Returning to his documented evidence, he narrowed his attention from the massive total of concealed files to a highly specific subgroup, noting that analysts had pinpointed hundreds of documents suitable for public release with only minor redactions rather than complete suppression. This nuance was vital, as it framed the conflict not as a binary choice between absolute secrecy and irresponsible exposure, but as a choice between measured transparency and persistent, unwarranted concealment. The lawmaker elaborated that his team had performed a comparative review of those potentially releasable documents against accessible public databases, including federal employment records, official visitor logs, and political contribution registries. He revealed that a vast majority of those specific files contained references to individuals who were either federal employees, major political contributors, or both. He offered this correlation plainly, permitting the inherent implications to resonate without added dramatic commentary. In response, the bureau chief warned against deriving definitive conclusions from mere coincidences, stressing that decisions regarding document suppression are never influenced by an individual's political ties, career history, or financial donations. He reiterated that proximity does not equate to culpability, and that investigative dossiers routinely mention various individuals for reasons entirely separate from any illicit behavior. However, the conversation had unequivocally moved from abstract legal principles to observable patterns that seemingly aligned with spheres of influence. The representative relied on juxtaposition rather than direct charges, recognizing that in a formal inquiry, presenting stark contrasts can be as impactful as an explicit accusation. When such a high proportion of needlessly concealed documents involves individuals adjacent to political power or significant financial resources, the need for rigorous oversight becomes increasingly pressing. The Attorney General maintained a measured tone, repeating that privacy determinations are strictly governed by statutory law rather than social standing, and that protecting reputations remains a significant duty even when no formal accusations are brought forward. Nevertheless, the session had arrived at a juncture where standard procedural language appeared inadequate and defensive when contrasted with the presented statistical patterns. The hearing, initially predicted to conclude without much fanfare, had transformed into a critical examination of the agency's fundamental trustworthiness. The lawmakers' initial phrasing had blossomed into a robust, structured hypothesis, suggesting that administrative secrecy might be serving to protect interests far removed from general safety. Despite the officials' insistence that career professionals handled the majority of these reviews in accordance with established protocols, the crimson folders stayed open, each referenced statistic amplifying the core conflict. Legislative oversight requires concrete explanations when faced with quantifiable discrepancies. The representative maintained the conversational momentum, refusing to settle for broad generalities as he highlighted specific details from his records, shifting the focus from overarching data trends to particular, identifiable instances. He directed attention to a singular document within the releasable subset, describing it as containing travel logs and witness statements related to excursions associated with the scrutinized properties. He noted that while internal reviewers had marked this specific file for partial disclosure, it continued to be entirely suppressed. This observation highlighted a procedural anomaly rather than a speculative theory, as the divergence between a recommendation for release and a subsequent decision for total concealment naturally prompts questions regarding who altered the directive and for what purpose. The director declined to confirm the specifics of any single hidden document during the public forum, citing the strict regulations that control discussions of sensitive materials in open environments. He articulated that verifying specific details could undermine protection protocols and risk the exposure of safeguarded data. While his delivery was composed, his refusal to address the substantive elements of the example allowed the lawmaker's underlying narrative to stand unchallenged. Adding further context, the representative pointed out that multiple individuals mentioned within that particular withheld document had collectively provided substantial financial support to political campaigns in recent years, a detail sourced from open public databases. He inquired directly whether the persistent concealment of that specific file was purely accidental given those notable political affiliations. The director answered that financial contributions and employment backgrounds are entirely irrelevant to classification protocols, which rely exclusively on legal criteria and threat evaluations, adding that case files often reference innocent parties whose reputations require careful safeguarding. The legal official supported this perspective, articulating that privacy rights are fundamental constitutional concepts designed to prevent unwarranted public embarrassment rather than mere discretionary courtesies. Despite these reassurances, the dialogue had transcended legal terminology and had become a fundamental debate about public trust and whether societal influence genuinely plays a role in governmental transparency. The lawmaker's approach involved laying out the visible patterns and then compelling the witnesses to formally dismiss their relevance. Continuing his line of questioning, the representative brought up a separate file that had only recently been made public due to a judicial mandate resulting from a transparency lawsuit. He detailed that the document included statements identifying frequent guests at the properties in question and noted that it had been kept hidden for years despite internal assessments purportedly supporting its release. He emphasized that the eventual publication of this document did not precipitate a security crisis, did not endanger operational assets, and did not hinder any active investigations. He then posed a pointed question to the legal official: if a judge could safely order the document's release without causing catastrophic harm, what justified its extensive delay? The official responded that she lacked intimate knowledge of the exhaustive deliberative history for every single page and stressed that transparency decisions undergo complex, multi-layered reviews across various departments. She advised against drawing broad conclusions from a singular internal communication or an isolated step in a multifaceted interagency coordination process. While her response was legally precise and cautious, it failed to neutralize the representative's primary assertion that the information had ultimately been unveiled without causing any demonstrable damage. The lawmaker countered that legislative review becomes meaningless if agencies constantly claim that their internal debates are too intricate to be scrutinized. He asserted that when preliminary analysts suggest partial disclosure but senior leadership enforces total secrecy, the reviewing committee is entitled to comprehend the justification for that reversal. As the focus shifted toward internal departmental communications, the intensity of the exchange increased significantly. The representative referenced a purported internal correspondence detailing the debate over that exact document. Reading sections that revealed an initial push for partial transparency was later overridden in favor of complete concealment pending further evaluation, with the highest legal office allegedly concurring with the delay. The takeaway was clear. The choice to withhold the information was not exclusively made by the initial reviewers. The legal official noted that such messages reflect standard deliberative discussions and that isolating specific quotes can fabricate a deceptive storyline. She maintained that transparency choices often shift as new variables, such as operational hazards and civil liability risks, are thoroughly evaluated. The Bureau leader contributed that organizations must evaluate the compounding impact of releasing information, warning that the aggregate effect of fragmented disclosures can lead to unforeseen and detrimental outcomes. However, the rationale that broader context necessitates secrecy did not negate the documented evidence that a recommendation for partial transparency had indeed existed. The representative insisted that the essence of oversight is compromised when internal recommendations are routinely discarded without a clear, accessible explanation. The atmosphere in the room, initially characterized by formal politeness, was now centered entirely on a vital concern: whether transparency rules were being implemented equitably or if they were being adjusted whenever sensitive files involved prominent figures. Throughout this segment, the lawmaker deliberately avoided naming specific individuals, opting instead to highlight that public faith relies entirely on the impartial application of the law, regardless of a person's societal position. He presented the dilemma as an institutional flaw rather than a partisan attack, though his focus on patterns connected to authority significantly elevated the importance of the inquiry. The director firmly dismissed any insinuation that political motives sway transparency choices, reiterating that career civil servants handle the bulk of these evaluations under strict regulatory frameworks. Similarly, the legal official restated that neither past employment nor financial donations insulate anyone from appropriate examination within official records. In retort, the representative brought the discussion back to the overwhelming percentage of documents deemed safe, grounding his argument in mathematical realities rather than mere speculation. He posited that when such a massive portion of the archive is internally judged to be benign, its continued blanket suppression requires a highly specific and formally documented justification. He clarified that effective oversight cannot be appeased by vague allusions to procedural complexity. It demands concrete proof that protocols are being administered uniformly. The director argued back that the authority to withhold information relies on a multitude of factors, requiring agencies to balance privacy, potential reputational damage, and the integrity of future inquiries. Nevertheless, the conversation had shifted from theoretical legal protections to a direct inquiry regarding the potentially selective application of those very safeguards. Transitioning from legal theory to underlying motivations, the representative delicately inquired whether the ongoing secrecy might be subtly influenced by the presence of politically or socially significant individuals within the files. He did not ask for an admission of guilt, but rather demanded a formal, on-the-record denial. The director stated with absolute certainty that political sensitivities hold no weight in the evaluation process, while the legal official confirmed that the department never customizes its transparency based on an individual's influence. Yet, the fundamental nature of the hearing had shifted from a dry, statistical review into a profound challenge regarding institutional honor and consistency. The lawmaker's technique was cumulative and persistent, structuring his inquiries to leave the officials with only two viable paths: provide an exhaustive explanation for the statistical anomalies or completely deny any inappropriate behavior, while the glaring data remained clearly visible. The physical presence of the crimson folder served as a constant, silent reminder that his arguments were anchored in actual documents rather than imaginative rhetoric. Every statistic provided and every specific file mentioned narrowed the debate to a singular question: whether confidentiality was being properly utilized to protect valid legal interests or improperly wielded to shield influential networks from public embarrassment. The committee leader briefly paused the proceedings to restore standard protocol and remind participants to adhere to their allotted speaking times, but this administrative interjection failed to diminish the palpable intensity in the room. Other participating members began drafting their own subsequent inquiries, with some focusing heavily on the need to maintain investigative purity, while others highlighted the critical importance of public disclosure once a case reaches its conclusion. Although the scope of the dialogue expanded, the central dilemma persisted. Thousands of files, mostly devoid of genuine security risks, remained hidden from the public. Wrapping up his designated time, the representative stated that proper legislative review demands transparency in the final decisions as well as the underlying methodologies. He declared that if subordinate analysts suggested transparency while superiors mandated secrecy, the oversight panel was obligated to deeply investigate the mechanics and rationales behind those reversals. He did not back down following this assertion, nor did he let the conversation wander into vague, hypothetical scenarios. Turning another page within his dossier, he broadened his focus from isolated examples to systemic legal interpretations, emphasizing that the dispute involved the widespread application of executive withholding powers. He argued that if major security threats were absent in most instances, and if preliminary reviewers had advised partial disclosure for a large segment of the archive, the committee was entitled to a highly specific legal rationale that justified the continued, indiscriminate suppression. This was framed not merely as a conversational request, but as a foundational constitutional requirement, given that the legislative branch is rendered powerless to conduct oversight if it is blocked from understanding the logic behind executive branch actions. The room had transitioned from arguing over document counts to scrutinizing core legal philosophies, a shift that carried immense institutional significance. The legal official repeated that transparency evaluations are complex and layered, encompassing ongoing investigative needs, personal privacy, and cross-departmental consultations that are rarely captured in brief summary documents. She stressed that ultimate conclusions must consider variables beyond a single memorandum, including the threat of civil lawsuits and the collateral damage inflicted upon individuals who have never faced formal charges, resting her defense on the inherent complexity of the system. The director agreed, noting that the power to classify documents relies on comprehensive risk evaluations where even non-security factors can validate the withholding of information. However, the representative's demeanor implied that citing complexity is an unacceptable substitute for clarity, especially when thousands of records remain inaccessible. He subsequently brought forward an independent legal review commissioned by the panel regarding the use of personal privacy as a shield for investigative data. He indicated that this external analysis determined that privacy concerns alone are insufficient to warrant the permanent concealment of records detailing potential illicit behavior, especially when targeted redactions represent a viable, less restrictive alternative. He structured this argument with meticulous precision. If security threats are minimal and privacy can be managed through blacking out names, the prolonged, sweeping concealment of the archives requires a far more compelling justification. The legislative audience deeply absorbed this logical framework because it successfully condensed a convoluted legal battle into a highly structured, understandable test. The Bureau leader responded that federal entities must evaluate compounding damages and the long-term impacts on future inquiries, suggesting that transparency today could negatively reshape the judicial landscape tomorrow. The lawmaker countered this by asserting that genuine oversight cannot be pacified by theoretical, undocumented anxieties. He reiterated the internal finding that an overwhelming majority of the files posed no identifiable security threat, acknowledging the importance of privacy while insisting it could be adequately protected through careful redaction rather than absolute suppression. The debate grew increasingly focused on whether the executive offices were truly employing the least restrictive methods available under the law. The legal official maintained that internal reviews require balancing intertwined factors that defy simple categorization, but the lingering question was whether these complex factors were being applied uniformly or with selective bias. The dialogue then shifted from legal doctrines to institutional motivations, while remaining strictly anchored in documented evidence. The representative questioned whether the persistent secrecy might be affected, even on a subconscious level, by the inclusion of highly influential or formerly powerful figures within the dossiers. He refrained from directly accusing the witnesses of active interference, presenting the issue instead as a systemic vulnerability, asking if the presence of prominent identities could induce a level of caution that exceeds statutory requirements. The director forcefully rejected this insinuation, repeating that career staff manage the vast majority of evaluations and that appointed leaders do not micromanage the outcomes. The legal official agreed, declaring that her department never calibrates its transparency practices based on a person's societal rank or financial contributions. Nevertheless, the lawmaker's position did not require an outright confession. It was built entirely upon observable data trends. He reminded the Assembly of the significant portion of potentially releasable files that contained references to individuals intertwined with federal authority or substantial political funding. While he did not assert that this correlation definitively proved a corrupt motive, he maintained that such a dense concentration warranted exceptionally rigorous scrutiny. He argued that the very purpose of legislative oversight is to verify the equitable application of rules, particularly when powerful interests intersect with sensitive investigative materials. The director countered that reputational damage is a profound concern that must be heavily weighed, especially regarding individuals mentioned in passing who were never indicted. The representative retorted that protecting reputations must never serve as a convenient excuse to shield the politically affluent from necessary public scrutiny. The tension escalated as the discourse moved past administrative jargon and into the broader realm of the government's ethical credibility. The legal official emphasized her department's respect for legislative authority, while firmly noting their concurrent duty to prevent the unfair smearing of uncharged citizens. The lawmaker responded that the tool of redaction was created for that exact purpose, permitting the concealment of identifying specifics while allowing the core findings of the investigation to reach the public. It became distinctly clear to everyone present that the conflict was no longer about a handful of documents. It was a fundamental debate over whether the executive branch was enforcing maximum secrecy in situations where minimal discretion would suffice. The director repeated his warning about the mosaic effect, where seemingly harmless, isolated releases can be pieced together to expose highly sensitive operational frameworks. The representative dismissed this, arguing that theoretical mosaic risks cannot be used as an endless justification for opacity, especially when internal audits indicate the actual danger is remarkably low. The physical folder on the desk remained a quiet but powerful visual anchor, counterbalancing the official's broad defensive statements. Though the representative maintained an even, unraised voice, the steady accumulation of his documented points generated immense conversational pressure. He pointed out that the primary investigation had been officially closed for years, arguing that if total secrecy is maintained indefinitely without a clear, legally sound explanation, public trust inevitably decays, not merely because data is hidden, but because the reasoning behind the concealment appears incomprehensible. The legal official argued that declassification schedules are driven by active legal realities rather than simple calendar dates, yet the stark lack of any definitive timeline for disclosure left the room with a profound sense of perpetual, unchecked secrecy. As the inquiry advanced, it honed in on the exact nature of the internal administrative processes. The lawmaker questioned whether the findings of the internal review boards were strictly advisory or if they carried binding authority, and sought data on how frequently senior leadership altered those preliminary suggestions. The director explained that such boards offer evaluations within a much larger chain of command, and that the ultimate decisions incorporate a wide array of additional intelligence. The legal official added that robust internal debate is crucial for responsible governance, and that no single preliminary memo dictates final policy. The representative countered that true oversight requires a clear view of how often and why these recommendations are overturned. Without such visibility, The reviewing committee is completely unable to ensure that standards are being applied fairly. The committee leader interjected once more to preserve order, but the core dialogue continued to circle the paramount issue of administrative accountability. The lawmakers stressed that the constitutional separation of powers was never intended to completely shield executive choices from legitimate legislative examination. While acknowledging that the authority to classify data rests with the executive branch, he maintained that the legislative branch holds the unquestionable right to scrutinize how that immense power is being utilized. The director warned that forcing the release of sensitive files requires intricate coordination with various intelligence sectors and cannot be hastily resolved during an open committee session. The legal official supplemented this by stating that formal demands for documents would be carefully processed through proper legal avenues in accordance with constitutional limits. However, the proceedings had evolved to a stage where such procedural warnings sounded more like defensive maneuvering than authoritative declarations. Concluding his dedicated time, the representative stated that when thousands of files remain suppressed years after a case's conclusion, despite internal memos supporting partial transparency, the legislative body possesses a fundamental duty to investigate the true motives behind the ongoing concealment. He did not issue an immediate threat, but rather delineated the logical next steps based on the committee's established powers, slowly closing the crimson folder not as a sign of surrender, but as an indication that his comprehensive, documented argument had been fully submitted into the public record. The conflict had transcended statistical debates and blossomed into a defining test of whether governmental secrecy powers were being used to defend valid legal principles or merely to insulate the reputations of the highly influential. Having established this robust framework, the lawmaker transitioned from inquisitive dialogue to actionable intent. Turning to the committee leader, he emphasized that legislative duties do not simply evaporate when officials refuse to provide thorough answers in a public setting. He asserted that the legislative branch is equipped with enforcement mechanisms that extend far beyond mere questioning, designed specifically for instances where executive transparency falls short. He formally announced that if comprehensive explanations were not supplied through subsequent written responses, he fully intended to initiate subpoenas to compel the handover of the remaining hidden dossiers. He added that the committee would also seek the internal communications regarding the classification choices themselves, including the preliminary board memos and the senior-level override directives, utilizing formal compulsory measures. The mood in the chamber shifted dramatically once more. No new data was presented, but the dialogue had formally escalated from a theoretical debate to a scenario involving tangible, enforceable consequences. The power of subpoena is far from merely rhetorical. It brings strict legal obligations and the distinct possibility of judicial intervention. While the committee leader did not issue an immediate ruling, he confirmed that panel members were free to submit formal requests for such actions, a procedural nod that underscored the severe escalation of the proceedings. The director responded by reaffirming his bureau's commitment to honoring lawful oversight inquiries within the strict parameters of national security laws, while repeating his warning that forced disclosures demand delicate coordination with intelligence entities. The legal official added that her department deeply respects legislative authority, but insisted that the constitutional separation of powers mandates the highly secure handling of investigative files. She stressed that any official demands would be processed through standard legal protocols and that secrecy designations cannot simply be discarded during a televised hearing. The representative firmly replied that constitutional divisions do not eliminate basic accountability and that the legislative branch is rendered useless if executive concealment is entirely immune to review. He reiterated that extensive time had passed since the criminal aspects of the case were resolved and that the internal assessments indicated a legally sound path for measured public disclosure. The disagreement had crystallized into a severe institutional clash regarding the absolute limits of executive authority. Several other lawmakers from both political factions posed brief follow-up inquiries, with some prioritizing the safety of ongoing investigations and others demanding strict schedules for document reviews. While the conversation diversified, the primary tension established at the onset remained unaltered. Thousands of files were still hidden, an overwhelming majority were reportedly harmless to national security, hundreds were deemed ready for redacted release. and a significant portion of those files mentioned individuals connected to federal influence or massive political funding. These core statistics were never explicitly disproven, even as their ultimate meaning was fiercely debated. The director continued to rely on the defense of established procedural guidelines and the professionalism of his career staff, warning again about the unfair reputational damage that could afflict uncharged individuals. The legal official maintained her stance that privacy is a foundational legal principle deeply embedded within her department's operations rather than an afterthought. Nevertheless, neither official managed to present a comprehensive, detailed explanation that successfully reconciled the internal assessments of harmlessness with the reality of ongoing, absolute suppression. The glaring lack of such an explanation evolved into the defining narrative of the event. The representative made a brief final remark on procedure, stating that true transparency requires visibility into both the final outcomes and the underlying logic. If junior staff advised openness and senior staff mandated secrecy, the committee is constitutionally bound to understand the mechanics of that reversal. He refrained from accusing the officials of specific malicious acts, opting instead to demand thoroughly documented justifications. He warned that formal written inquiries would soon be dispatched, and that vague or evasive replies would drastically increase the likelihood of compulsory legal action. The Crimson Folder, though shut, had definitively achieved its goal by successfully reframing governmental secrecy as an assertion that requires robust evidence rather than blind, unquestioning deference. By the time the session concluded, no subpoenas had been officially authorized, and the committee leader noted that subsequent actions would depend entirely on the quality of the written responses provided. However, the threat of legal compulsion had shifted from a distant possibility to a highly probable next step. What was initially scheduled as a mundane briefing on record-keeping had mutated into a high-stakes constitutional standoff regarding the appropriate boundaries of classification power. The session officially ended, but the controversy had merely entered a newly intensified phase. Almost immediately, video segments of the confrontation spread rapidly across digital platforms and broadcast networks. Media analysts largely ignored the emotional tone of the event, choosing instead to focus heavily on the undeniable mathematics: the thousands of concealed files, the massive percentage deemed harmless, the hundreds flagged for potential release, and the heavy correlation with influential figures. The public discourse shifted away from abstract notions of security and anchored itself deeply in these quantifiable discrepancies. Advocates for the representative's aggressive transparency argued that government oversight is effectively crippled if it relies solely on vague executive reassurances, especially when internal documents suggest that openness is highly feasible. They maintained that while the executive branch holds the constitutional right to secure sensitive data, this power must remain vulnerable to legislative auditing to prevent the catastrophic decay of public confidence. Conversely, supporters of the investigative agencies highlighted the immense complexities of information law, pointing out that privacy mandates, cross-agency treaties, and compounding threat evaluations make disclosure decisions incredibly difficult. Legal scholars noted that disputes over governmental secrecy are rarely straightforward, acknowledging that executive departments hold specialized expertise in evaluating potential risks. Yet, even these cautious experts conceded that when internal recommendations for transparency are credibly brought to light, an intense demand for public explanation is entirely justified. Ultimately, the legislative hearings serve to amplify rather than resolve the underlying friction. If formal subpoenas are indeed issued, the conflict will transition from public debate to secretive legal negotiations, potentially requiring intervention from the judicial branch. Should an independent inspector general be called upon to review the matter, the analysis could span several months, meticulously evaluating how consistently transparency rules were applied across the entire archive. If further files are eventually unsealed through judicial mandates or negotiated agreements, the public narrative will inevitably pivot again, either validating the agency's extreme caution or cementing the public's fear of unwarranted, protective secrecy. For the time being, the official record reflects a highly documented, robust challenge against the expansive use of governmental secrecy. The remaining questions are highly structured and profoundly concrete, If massive volumes of files remain hidden long after a case's closure, what specific legal benchmarks dictate their eventual release? If preliminary analysts recommend disclosure with careful redactions, how frequently are those professional opinions upheld without executive interference? When privacy is cited as the primary concern, are targeted redactions genuinely considered before absolute suppression is authorized? Furthermore, when these concealed files heavily feature individuals connected to wealth and power, how can the executive branch definitively prove that societal status plays absolutely no part in maintaining the veil of secrecy? These inquiries transcend typical political rhetoric. They strike at the very core of how constitutional oversight is meant to function. This remarkable exchange did not devolve into unprofessional theatrics or aggressive shouting matches. It unfolded methodically through the careful presentation of documented facts, statistical claims, and gradual procedural escalation. The initial 7 words that sparked the confrontation were not merely a provocative headline, but a carefully constructed thesis, fully supported by the pages of a crimson folder that were turned deliberately, one by one. While the agency officials staunchly defended their right to institutional discretion, the representatives successfully challenged the sheer breadth and potential bias of its application. The committee failed to settle the massive dispute during that single gathering, but it succeeded in dragging the controversy out of the shadows of internal deliberation and placing it firmly onto the public record. True legislative oversight does not end simply because a meeting is adjourned. It continues its vital work through written demands, negotiated disclosures, potential legal subpoenas, and, if absolutely necessary, formal judicial litigation. The highly publicized moment involving the Crimson Folder was not the conclusion of the saga, but rather the critical turning point where unchallenged secrecy transitioned into a fiercely contested demand for accountability. Whether the subsequent phases of this conflict are resolved through voluntary agency cooperation or mandatory legal enforcement will ultimately determine how the delicate balance between public transparency and necessary confidentiality is redefined. The only absolute certainty remaining is that the undeniable statistics presented in that chamber will not simply fade away just because the legislative session came to a close.